Mysterious remains of rusting ships stranded in an arid desert.
It was ecological suicide.
A ghostly set of concrete teeth high in the Italian peaks.
A very stark and strange sight to have in this largely beautiful mountain landscape.
An eerie collection of buildings hidden in a remote forest.
It's like a village of the damned. You can tell that something happened here.
And a technological marvel now rotting away in a forgotten cove.
It's so destroyed, it's hard to believe there's any other reason for that level of destruction other than some major cataclysmic event.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? In the southwest of the former Soviet Union is the country of Uzbekistan. And not far from the small town of Moynok is an astonishing sight. For mile after mile, all you can see is a dry and dusty desert landscape. There, in the middle of this sandy expanse, there are ships of every size, from small to large. But where is the water?
It's a very odd thing, seeing a boat in the desert. You think of water instantly. A boat is an indicative sign of water, but then you look around and there's none available.
It's like an armada of rusting hulks in the middle of the desert without a shoreline anywhere in sight. It is an intensely post-apocalyptic image. You don't have to be an expert to tell that something has gone extremely wrong here.
The town of Moynok is virtually deserted. But what has gone on here? The only clue is the symbol of a fish which adorns the town's sign.
There are signs that fishing was absolutely once very important here. But what makes this so extraordinary is that there's no water to be seen. In fact, it's miles from the nearest sea.
So what happened? Where has the sea gone? And why was Moynok abandoned? The answer to this puzzle lies more than 4,000 kilometers away in the heart of Russia's capital, Moscow. In the 1950s, Uzbekistan was part of the Soviet Union, an empire 2.5 times the size of the USA, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The country was still recovering from the most destructive war in human history. The Soviet Union's notorious war leader, Joseph Stalin, died in March 1953, and he left behind a country in very poor condition. This was the grim situation facing Nikita Khrushchev, the new first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The regime responded in the only way it knew how, by seizing complete control.
The Soviet Union ran on a command economy. All the decisions were made at the top. And they would decide, comrade, you will grow the wheat, and you will grow the cotton, and you will make the iron and steel. The individual districts, and certainly individual workers, had very little say in the matter, and the technocrats in charge thought they had all the information they needed to make all the decisions.
Each Soviet state had to provide goods and raw materials to the central government, who would in turn provide food and other products. everything was controlled by Moscow.
There was no room for experimentation. There was no room for anybody to deviate from the central authority. So once the order came down from on high, everybody got in line and conformed.
The gaze of the Soviet leadership fell on a new target for exploitation: Moynok. It's almost impossible to imagine now when you look at the desert that surrounds it. But 60 years ago, Moynok lay at the edge of the fourth largest inland stretch of water in the world: the Aral Sea. 40,000 of its citizens were either fishermen or worked at its fish processing plant, the largest in the Soviet Union. Almas Tovashev was one of them.
More than 200 vessels were engaged in the fishing industry. More than 100 vessels were transporting fish to the fish canning factory, where 1,200 people worked and annually produced up to 12 million cans of fish.
The fishing industry was able to thrive in the Aral Sea because it was fairly shallow all round, so it was actually quite easy to fish. And by its nature, it didn't actually freeze in the winter, so you could do fishing almost all year round.
Overall, 1/6 of Russia's annual fishing quota came from the Aral Sea. And a substantial industry thrived on its shores.
At that time, 80 to 90% of the fish production in Uzbekistan was provided by the Aral Sea. There were 34 species of fish, 20 of which were of commercial importance. Then there was one Moynok fishing canning factory, 12 fishing collective farms, and 6 fishing flotillas. The whole population was engaged in fishing.
But by 1990, all fishing had ended. The sea had become a desert. So what was the main reason for this extraordinary transformation? It was all because of something called white gold. We know it better as cotton.
Cotton's been grown in the Aral Basin for centuries, but this really ramped up under the leadership of Stalin when he announced to the world that the Soviet Union would be the leading producer of this crop.
It only rains about 4 inches a year in that part of Uzbekistan. That's about the same as the Mojave Desert in the US, or even the same as some parts of the Sahara. So they needed to irrigate, they needed to get water from somewhere else. Where did they get it? From the 2 rivers that fed the Aral Sea. They dammed them up, they made reservoirs, they made this huge complex of irrigation canals, thousands of miles of irrigation canals. It was a typical, vast, ambitious Soviet project.
But the crops needed more than water to flourish. Chemical fertilizers were used in vast quantities, 20 times the usual amounts.
Cotton, especially the way the Soviets grew it, took a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides. They sprayed this stuff on with abandon. It flowed out, it polluted the groundwater, so what little water did flow into the Aral Sea was heavily polluted with toxins.
However, the Soviet plan to concentrate on cotton production at the expense of the Aral Sea worked.
Uzbekistan became the dominant supplier of cotton, the dominant grower of cotton in the Soviet Union, and remains a major grower of cotton.
But there was a huge environmental price to pay.
If you've got 4/5 of your water source coming from elsewhere and being brought in to maintain and sustain the sea, if you shut that lifeblood off, things are going to change very dramatically.
It was ecological suicide, because once they took all the water out of those rivers, there wasn't enough water to feed the Aral Sea. In this hot environment, it's sunny most of the time, there's a lot of evaporation. Without water continuing to flow into it, the Aral Sea began to evaporate.
People understood that there was less water. It was not enough, even for watering gardens and use on the farms.
Moynok's fishermen depended on the lake for their livelihoods, so they followed its shrinking shores. But they soon realized there was an even bigger problem. The fish were dying.
Not only is the shoreline moving away because you're decreasing the volume of the water, but you're increasing the salinity, and it went from about 10 grams per litre to over 100 grams per litre, a massive jump, 10 times more salt in the water. And the fish can't handle that. The fish essentially get poisoned.
It was turning from a thriving, rich, freshwater ecosystem into a dead sea.
By the late 1980s, the last native Aral fish had vanished, lost to the shrinking toxic sea. In just 34 years, the sea level dropped by 16 meters, and the shoreline receded by almost 160 kilometers.
The speed at which this actually happened is quite remarkable. And it's really quite shocking to see this jewel, one of the 4th largest inland seas in the world, suddenly just diminishing to a few sort of isolated lakes and really just a big dry desert.
A third of the seabed was exposed, spreading 100 million tons of dust and salt. Add to that the residue from the pesticides at the bottom of the sea, and you've got a highly toxic combination.
Ultimately, it all collapsed, and you can only imagine how heartbreaking life was for the people in that region. This had been their culture and their way of life for centuries, and have it all be obliterated literally in just a few decades must have just been devastating.
Today, the trawlers lie rusting at the edge of Moynok's harbor. A ghost fleet in a town where the sea is a distant memory. The few remaining people still living here are plagued by health problems. The Aral Sea has now become the Aral Desert.
It's a real cautionary tale in environmental destruction. An economy, it's not just a nice lifestyle or a pleasant vista, but crucial parts of economies depend on a healthy ecosystem.
When you see such a dramatic change, it shows us that how delicate the environments can be and how much we need to be aware that we don't flip the switch the wrong way and send those environments catastrophically into the wrong direction.
Hidden away in a forest 50 kilometers southwest of Berlin lies a vast complex of abandoned buildings.
It's like a village of the damned. You can tell that something happened here.
Due to its decrepit and dilapidating nature, it's a very unique and creepy environment.
In one building, there's a bathtub sitting by itself in the middle of a room. It's really mysterious what's going on here.
You can tell the amount of care that was taken when it was built. With its pillars and terraces and elaborate entrances, it's almost palatial.
There are around 60 separate buildings on the site, and the whole complex sprawls across 1.5 kilometers. But what dark secrets does this facility hold? And exactly how did one of the world's most evil men end up here? The answer lies in the spectacular Industrial Revolution in Germany during the final years of the 19th century. The extraordinary pace of progress in technology, machinery, and transport saw a once deeply divided country surpass even Great Britain to become, by the end of the 19th century, the world's leading industrial powerhouse. While technical schools turned out great thinkers and inventors, Germany's years of investment in education and training eventually paid rich dividends in the shape of a highly skilled and motivated workforce. The German population doubled between 1871 and 1910, and its capital, Berlin, grew by 300% in just 30 years.
Germany had its industrial revolution a bit later than some other European countries, but it more than made up for any delay. By the 1890s, it was thriving, fast-moving, almost chaotic.
Factories were booming. Labor was pouring in from impoverished rural areas into the big cities. People were crammed into crowded tenements, unhealthy living situations, and along with all those people came a lot of diseases.
Over 120 years ago, one disease in particular swept through Germany. It was responsible for 1 in 7 of all human deaths. It was tuberculosis.
It's a disease that's passed by coughing or sneezing. Germs get in the air, and in crowded conditions, it passes from person to person very easily.
Die Hygiene war damals natürlich auch nicht
Hygiene back then wasn't like today, of course. If there was a toothbrush at all in a working-class household, it was used by the whole family. So many people infected their children with tuberculosis without even knowing it.
Kinder unwissentlich mit Tuberkulose angesteckt.
For more than a century, tuberculosis was the most common cause of death, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. At the time, there was no cure, and 80% of those infected eventually died.
TB was not really treatable in the sense that there was a cure for it. What people tried to do was create a healthier environment for people with tuberculosis. And the idea was, it's a lung disease, it has something to do with air. Let's get them out of the city, out to where there's fresh air, dry air. It was very common for rich people to be able to get sent off to one of these hospitals in some lovely mountainous setting. But many of the victims of tuberculosis weren't affluent. They couldn't afford that.
So, a new kind of facility was needed. Beylitz Heilstätten was seen as the answer. Its aim was to provide cutting-edge care in a healthy setting, not for the very rich, but for the very poor.
An insurance company was behind the building of this sanatorium. They wanted to create this model clinic for workers in Berlin who had limited access to treatment otherwise.
But would it work? Would a patient coming from the squalor of Berlin actually have been helped in a sanatorium like this?
For people who lived in very crowded conditions, they were, many of them, factory workers. They didn't have a lot of money. They might not have had a lot of people at home who could take care of them in their sick condition. So to be able to go to this lovely retreat, even as their prognosis for getting better wasn't that great, it must have seemed like a kind of blessing.
Building began in 1898, and the initial construction phase took 4 years. The intricate ornamental facades and the light, spacious rooms were in stark contrast to the conditions the workers were used to back in the cities.
The Belitz Sanatorium isn't really like any other hospital where you might just have an operating theatre, you might have a corridor full of wards and, normal walls and ventilation systems, etc. What we're trying to do here is to create an atmosphere of well-being, to bring light in, to bring air in.
What's really kind of lovely is that they designed it to feel like a resort, like a beautiful country town. I think the respect they showed to these sick people who were not affluent, who weren't paying their own way, was really something admirable.
But with war on the horizon, there were actually darker reasons for this apparent benevolence.
The Kaiser was simply afraid of the inability of some of his people to serve in the military. Also, the economy would have lost its cheap labourers. That was the real reason behind the construction of this sanatorium.
Eventually, there would be beds for 1,200 patients, which made Belitz one of the largest sanatoriums in the world. It was also briefly home to the most notorious figure of the 20th century. When the First World War began in 1914, the hospital found itself in the front line. Belitz Heilstätten was requisitioned as a field hospital for the Red Cross. The number of beds increased to more than 1,500. One of its patients was a young corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler.
Hitler was a patient there for 2 months towards the end of 1916, when he was hit by a grenade in his left leg and was sent to Belitz for treatment.
After the war, there was a resurgence of tuberculosis, and in 1920, Belitz Heilstätten reverted to a sanatorium. For more than 20 years, it continued to treat the disease. But a new treatment for tuberculosis was just around the corner.
Tuberculosis remained a serious problem in the developed world until shortly after World War II, when the antibiotic streptomycin was discovered and turned out to be pretty effective at treating the disease.
By the mid-1950s, tuberculosis had become a curable disease, and the need for the hospital slowly declined. But that wasn't quite the end of Belitz. After World War II, the Russians took over the eastern sector of Berlin, and Belitz served as a Soviet military hospital for the next 50 years.
The Soviets operated Belitz Sanatorium as the largest military hospital outside of their country's borders. In 1991, the Soviet troops slowly started their withdrawal, and in 1994, the grounds were empty again.
Today, this once vital hospital is a ghostly shell. The disease it was built to beat, now a footnote in history. Or is it? With the emergence in the 1980s of drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis, Belitz Heilstätten serves to remind us that the battle against this potentially fatal disease continues still.
The size of the epidemic of tuberculosis in the early 20th century was large. Its impact was felt wide through Europe. Sites like Belitz help us remember that, and with the onset and increase of modern tuberculosis, perhaps is a really good reminder of the seriousness of the disease.
More than 2,000 meters up in the Italian Alps is the most extraordinary sight. punching through tons of snow are rows of menacing conical structures.
They're these strange pyramid-like structures that almost look like a modern art installation.
Seeing hundreds of these concrete teeth jutting up out of the ground in the Alpine landscape is almost hard to grasp what that is.
The bizarre set of teeth are made of concrete and iron and range in size up to 1 meter tall. They stretch out over the remote mountaintops in a series of long clusters. But why were they built at such a remote location? And what could their strange purpose be?
What's really odd is where these things are, right near the top of the mountain. They just don't belong there.
It looks very medieval. It's almost exactly out of Game of Thrones. A very stark and strange sight to have in this largely beautiful mountain landscape.
A clue as to what these rows of conical spikes are can be found in the valley below. A labyrinth of secret tunnels that stretch deep into the mountain itself lurk behind a secret entrance disguised as a rock, which is built into the side of the valley.
When you look at it, it seems incredibly solid, and it blends almost seamlessly into the background. Someone went to an incredible effort to build that here.
Who built this bizarre Alpine structure? And what was its purpose? The answer lies in the uneasy peace that existed across Western Europe in the 1930s. Germany still simmered with resentment at the harsh reparations imposed on it by the Treaty of Versailles, and its people turned to Hitler and National Socialism for salvation. Meanwhile, Italy fell under the spell of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Incredibly, less than 20 years after the end of a conflict that killed millions, the dark clouds of war gathered once more over the continent. That was why the major European powers looked to their borders and began to fortify them with a series of elaborate defenses.
All of this started in France with the country's seemingly impenetrable Maginot Line. And at the same time, the Germans were building their own version, the Siegfried Line, across their western front.
All through Europe, you see these border defense lines. This is a reasonable precaution by most European countries that had genuine threats.
In 1931, Mussolini's engineers began to build what was seen as the answer to the threat of attack. It was a line of defenses that aimed to protect Italy over a 1,600-kilometer front through the Italian Alps. From Ventimiglia on the west coast to Fiume in the east. It was known as the Vallo Alpino, or the Alpine Wall. Rows of concrete and iron teeth crowned the ridges, and the valleys below are lined with gun emplacements and bunkers for troops. However, this section of the Alpine Wall faced not a hostile enemy, but Mussolini's supposed closest ally, Adolf Hitler's newly annexed Austria.
Mussolini was rather distrustful of Hitler. He knew that Hitler had expansionist ideas in Germany and certainly had eyes on Austria. Now, this meant problems for the Italians because they had annexed this one region, the South Tyrol of Austria after 1918. Mussolini, understanding Hitler, knew that Hitler would likely want to demand this territory and could attack Italy and take the Tyrol.
Since World War I, fast-moving tanks had become the most dominant weapon on the battlefield. And Germany was the master of this new type of warfare. How would the Italian Alpine defenses be able to stop Hitler's new mechanized army in its tracks?
So the dragon's teeth, or the denti di drago, were wooden poles that were pounded into the ground and then cast cement around them, capped off with an iron pyramid or cone. This creates a barrier for which armored vehicles and troops cannot pass through, and effectively funneling a large armored force into effectively kill zones.
The Italians designed an elaborate network of interconnected bunkers and guns to counter any German advance. The fortifications were named Defense in Depth. But would they work?
The idea of having multiple layers of defense is that you'll slow down the momentum of an attack, making it much easier to repel.
It's a series of strong points. It will stop and delay any enemy advance. This gives the defender time to move up reserves for a counterattack.
Hidden in the side of the mountain is the heavily camouflaged secret entrance to the Italian Alpine fortress. This is the fortified door to bunker number 20. The door opens to reveal a network of passages that link secret rooms and machine gun posts. Local guide Ludwig Schopf knows exactly how dangerous it was.
So we stay here in the machine gun room of the bunker number 20. And here inside were 3 soldiers. The room is outside of the rock. Here is beginning the rock, and here outside of the rock. And the soldiers knows that they were the first people to die.
The bunker's heavy camouflage was designed to give the Italians the best possible chance of destroying the enemy before they could make an attack.
They would cover the face of the bunker with rock slurry material. You could not tell that this is not part of a cliff face until you're actually there, and then the guns open up on you.
But how secure were the bunkers themselves?
The bunkers were built using a vast amount of concrete, up to 13 feet deep in places.
What they did was they actually built concrete in and amongst the rock units to try and utilize the fact that you've got these strong rocks either side of the pass and act as a natural defense, and then build round that natural defense with some man-made fortifications.
What made Mussolini think that Hitler would attack here? On the Austrian side of the border, there is a simple mule track which wouldn't have supported the weight of a tank.
But the Italians were worried that the Germans would construct a road into that region, allowing armored vehicles, tanks, and a large number of troops to pass into the area.
Yes, it's quite possible the Germans could send troops up here, because that is in fact how they broke through mountain defense lines.
But were the fortifications ever used?
With the fall of Mussolini and the advance of the Germans, the Vallo Alpino defensive structures were never actually used. The Italians just surrendered, and effectively the Germans walked into northern Italy.
The Vallo Alpino was actually, for the most part, very lightly guarded, and this would have been essentially border troops. These are not your frontline troops, so it provided no real defense at all.
The defending soldiers just gave up. And even though there was these very elaborate defensive structures that were constructed, in essence, they were never used and were useless.
Ironically, the Germans themselves later incorporated the Vallo Alpino into their own defenses against the Allies when they were sweeping through Italy. But in the end, the Vallo Alpino defenses were never used. Today, the rusting spikes of the dragon's teeth still dominate the landscape. They show just how far Mussolini was prepared to go to defend his country.
So when you see these different substructures now, it's an interesting historical throwback to a different time. For now, they're too expensive to remove, so we just sort of accept them as historical reminders, as well as just strange structures stuck in the middle of the Alps.
At the far eastern tip of Canada, just visible above the waterline, lies a rusting hulk of corroding metal.
It's almost like this monster of the deep. But why is this Leviathan being gradually reclaimed by the sea?
It lies in a forgotten cove off the coast of Newfoundland.
This partially submerged structure has such mystery around it, and that is compounded by where it sits in this completely idyllic setting.
This weird sort of assemblage of junk of rusty steel. One chunk of it you can recognize as some kind of modern trawler or something parked alongside. But what it's next to is like an exploded factory. It just doesn't belong there.
Only part of the structure is still visible. The rest is completely submerged.
It's so devastated, it's so destroyed, it's hard to believe there's any other reason for that level of destruction other than some major cataclysmic event.
These are the remains of HMS Calypso. Once it was one of the most technologically advanced ships in the British fleet. Now it's abandoned and rotting in the water. The reasons for Calypso's destruction can be found in the job she was designed to do. In the 1870s, Britain was a dominant global force. The British Empire, which at one point covered a quarter of the globe and included 450 million people, was at its height. Britain's ports were busy, bustling places where goods from all over the empire were processed to fuel and feed the Industrial Revolution, which was in full swing. Britain was a wealthy nation, a small country, but with extraordinary influence all over the world. All of this was thanks, in part, to its powerful navy.
Britain is absolutely the world superpower in the 1870s. Nobody has got a navy like Britain. Nobody has global reach like Britain. The Royal Navy exists to ensure that whatever difficulties there are in the world, nobody stops trade between Britain and her colonies.
Designed to fight competing European powers and pirates in the far corners of the globe, Calypso's design was a quirky combination of sail and steam.
She has a steam engine, but Calypso can also go under sail power. That means that Calypso can go on a long patrol and just use the wind to get where she needs to go.
This helped the vessel ply the waters that were in vast distant colonies where they may not have access to any resources. What we see here is design features that actually make the vessel more reliable and allow it to carry out its duties.
Endurance and toughness were the main strengths of the Calypso, and at her heart was her strange and revolutionary hull construction.
Her hull is actually composite. In fact, it's a steel hull, steel plates over an iron frame, all very modern. But then you've got this weird addition of wood. You can see the timber still sticking out of the water today. Now, why would you bother putting wood over steel?
Steel on its own won't protect the ship from what's called biofouling, which is the build-up of barnacles and algae, which can damage the hull and the propulsion system.
So the solution was to coat the hull with copper.
But you can't put copper plates on a steel hull because you get galvanic corrosion. You'll actually corrode the hull itself because of the reaction between these two metals. The only thing to do is to have your steel hull, put wood over the top of that, and then copper sheets in the same old way over the top again.
In June 1883, Calypso was launched with a great fanfare from the Chatham Dockyard in England. Built to police Britain's vast maritime empire, she's one of the last steam and sail ships ever built.
This wasn't an old-fashioned weakly armed warship. For her size, for her speed, she could pack quite a punch.
So how did such a powerful ship meet its end? Did pirates or enemy ships somehow overwhelm her impressive defenses? Calypso's design was actually her undoing.
As soon as the Royal Navy builds a ship, the French Navy or the German Navy builds a comparable ship and makes that Royal Navy vessel obsolete. In the 1870s, the kind of ship that we see in the Calypso is briefly very powerful, briefly useful against enemy vessels, and within 10 years is obsolete.
In 1902, Calypso was sent across the Atlantic to become a training ship for the Newfoundland Royal Navy Reserve. 60 years later, the decision was made to scrap her.
In 1968, it was finally decided that the vessel should be abandoned. It was towed to a small cove outside of Embry, Newfoundland, and it was burned to the waterline.
Today, HMS Calypso lies abandoned off the coast of Canada.
When I see a ship like the Calypso, I see a monument to so many people working so hard together to make something great.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.